The night my father raised his glass of rye whiskey and toasted my brother in front of 40 relatives. I was standing 6 feet away holding a casserole dish. I had casserole, yes, driven 3 hours to bring. Nobody asked me to put it down. Nobody asked me anything. Weekend, the kind of late October evening in Ontario, where the cold comes in fast, and the maple trees in the backyard have already dropped everything they had. The house smelled like my mother's stuffing, celery, sage, dried cranberries. And there was a hockey game on in the den that nobody was actually watching. My aunt had strung orange lights along the porch railing. My uncle was telling the same story about his fishing trip to Muskoka that he tells every year. It felt like every other Thanksgiving I had ever lived through in that house. Except my brother had just been accepted into the bar, officially, finally, a lawyer, and my father who had never once attended a single one of my convocations, not one, not even the first, stood at the head of the dining room table and said, in a voice that carried all the way to the kitchen, where I was still standing with that casserole dish, "This family finally has something to be proud of." I set the dish on the counter, very carefully, because I did not trust myself to do anything else in that moment. I have a PhD in epidemiology. I was, at that point, 31 years old, and I had spent the last 4 years leading a federally funded research team out of Ottawa that was building predictive models for infectious disease outbreak response across Canada. My work had been cited in policy briefings to the Minister of Health. I had published in journals that my father would never read and probably couldn't pronounce. I had done all of this, and I had done most of it quietly, because I had learned very early in my life that my accomplishments made my father uncomfortable in a way that my brothers never did. My brother had taken 7 years to finish a 3-year law degree. He had failed the bar twice. He was 34 years old. That night, my father called him the pride of the family. I drove home to Ottawa in the dark, and I cried somewhere around Kingston, and then I stopped crying because I had learned that too, how to stop. You get very efficient at it after a while. You develop a kind of internal off switch. You flip it. You keep driving. I want to tell you this story from the beginning, because I think the beginning matters, not the beginning where I was born, or the beginning where I first understood that I was different from my brother in my parents' eyes. The beginning that shaped everything that came after. I was 12 years old. My brother was 15. He had just been caught shoplifting from the Canadian Tire on Dundas Street. Nothing dramatic. A pack of batteries and a utility knife. And my parents sat us both down in the living room like I was somehow involved, and my father looked at my brother and said, "I know you're going to," my brother, and said, "We'll figure this out together." Then he looked at me. I had done nothing. I had been at a science fair that afternoon, where I had won second place for a project on water filtration, and I had the ribbon in my jacket pocket because I was planning to show them at dinner. My father said, "You need to be a better influence." I never showed them the ribbon. That was the template. That was the thing that got laid down so early that I didn't even recognize it had damage 4 years afterward. My brother could fail, stumble, disappear for weeks, blow through money, miss family events, make promises he never kept. And he was going through something. I could achieve, build, show up, give everything. And it was either ignored or treated as evidence that I had more to offer. My mother was not cruel. I want to be fair to her. She was not the kind of woman who said ugly things out loud, but she had a particular talent for not seeing what she didn't want to see. And she had spent 30 years not seeing the way my father treated me differently. She would call me on a Sunday and say, "Your brother needs help moving. Can you go?" Without asking whether I had plans, without asking how I was. And when I showed up with a rented truck and spent my whole weekend in the rain hauling boxes, she would say, "You're so capable. I don't know what we'd do without you." I used to think that was a compliment. I started to understand it differently somewhere around year 3 of my doctorate when my supervisor A woman who had built her entire career studying systems of care, and who had no patience for self-deception, looked at me during a check-in and said, "You're describing being instrumentalized by your family. You know that, right?" I didn't know what to say. I sat with it for a long time. After that meeting, instrumentalized, used as a function, valued for output, not for presence. She wasn't wrong. I had been sending money home since my first postdoc stipend. Not a lot at first, 200 here, 300 there. When my mother mentioned that my brother was struggling with rent, then more, when he failed the bar the first time and couldn't cover his student loan payment, then more again, when he moved back into my parents' house, and my father quietly mentioned that the property taxes had gone up. I told myself it was family. I told myself that's what you do. I did not tell myself that not once, in all those years of sending money, had anyone asked how I was managing my own expenses, or whether I had savings, or what I might need. Nobody asked what I needed. The year I turned 28, I was awarded a CIHR grant. That's the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, federal funding, competitive as anything, for a project that would eventually become the backbone of the outbreak prediction system I was leading. It was one of the most significant things that had happened in my professional life. I called my parents full sweetheart. My mother said, "Oh, and your brother got a new apartment, have I told you? The rent is $1,700 a month, can you imagine?" The conversation lasted 11 minutes. My grant was mentioned for about 45 seconds of it. I stopped expecting anything after that. Expectation is just a slow leak. It drains you quietly, and you don't notice until you're completely empty. I sealed it off. I kept working. I kept showing up at Thanksgiving and Christmas and Easter, with food I had cooked, and wine I had chosen, and a practiced smile that I could hold for approximately 4 hours before I needed to get in my car. I kept sending money. The thing that nobody tells you about being the responsible one in a family like mine is that responsibility becomes a trap. The more reliable you are, the more invisible you become. Your presence is assumed. Your contributions are folded into the background, like furniture. It's your brother calling at 11 on a Saturday night, panicky because he needs someone to proofread his articling applications, and it's you at your kitchen table at midnight with a red pen and a cold cup of tea. Because of course it is. Because who else would do it? I proofread those applications. He got the articling position. He got the bar. He became a lawyer. My father raised his glass of rye whiskey. I drove home in the dark and flipped my internal off switch somewhere around Kingston, 3 weeks after Thanksgiving. I got a phone call from my department head at the university affiliated with our research institute. There had been a development. The federal government was restructuring its public health response infrastructure in the wake of a series of reports on pandemic preparedness gaps. This was something that had been building for a while, something my team had actually contributed data toward, and there was a new position being created, Director of National Outbreak Intelligence. It was not a position that had existed before. It was being created specifically because of the work my team had done. They wanted me. I sat in my office for a long time after that call and looked out at the Rideau River through my window. It was November. The water was gray and flat. There were geese on the far bank doing whatever geese do in November. I thought, this is the thing. This is the thing I have been building toward it. Without even knowing I was building toward it, I thought I should call my parents. I didn't call my parents. I called my best friend instead. We had been friends since undergrad at Western. Through every ugly year of my 20s, she knew every version of this story. And she said, "Cass." Oh my God. Cass, that's it. That's the thing. Her name is the one that matters in this story, actually, because she was the one who kept me tethered to my own life when everything else was trying to pull me out of it. I didn't tell my family about the directorship for 2 months. I told myself it was because nothing was finalized, that there was paperwork, that it wasn't real until it was real. That was partly true. But mostly I think I needed to hold it for a while before I brought it into a space where it would be minimized. I needed to know, in my own bones, exactly what it was and exactly what it meant, before anyone else could make it smaller. The announcement went public in January. In January, there was a Government of Canada press release. There were interviews in a couple of health policy publications that my department circulated. My name was in the Ottawa Citizen. The piece described me as one of Canada's leading voices in infectious disease intelligence, which was the kind of sentence I had to read 3 times before I could hold it without flinching. My mother called me the evening the Citizen article came out. She had seen it. She said, "That's a big deal, isn't it?" Not a question. An assessment, delivered in the same tone she used when the grocery store was out of her preferred brand of bread. "That's unfortunate, isn't it?" I said yes. It was a significant role. She said, "Your father's going to want to see you at Easter." That was the whole conversation, essentially. I got off the phone and stood in my kitchen for a minute, and then I fed my cat and made dinner and did not think about it again that night, because what was there to think about? I had sealed that off years ago. I had developed and anticipated. What I was not prepared for was my brother. He called me in February. He had seen the article. He wanted to have lunch, which was unusual because we did not have lunch. We had awkward Christmas dinners and the occasional text about hockey. Lunch was not something we did. But he was in Ottawa for a legal conference, he said, and it would be good to catch up, and I was cautious, but I went. We went to a place near the market. He ordered a beer at noon, which I noted but did not comment on. He asked about my work. He seemed genuinely interested. Or what passed for genuinely interested, from someone who had spent most of his life perfecting the performance of interest without the substance of it. He asked about my team, about the scope of the directorship, about what it meant for public health infrastructure in Canada. I told him more than I should have. Maybe, because I was hungry for it. For someone in my family to actually see what I was doing, to actually want to understand it. That hunger is a weakness, and I know it. He ordered another beer. He said, "You know, I've been thinking about getting into healthcare law. There's a real gap there, especially post-pandemic. Policy work, regulatory stuff." I said that sounded like an interesting direction. He said, "It would really help to have a contact in the federal health infrastructure. Someone who could speak to the policy landscape." I put down my fork. I looked at him across the table. This man I had proofread applications for at midnight. This man whose moving boxes I had hauled in the rain. This man whose bar failure my father had called. Going through something. While my second-place ribbon sat in my jacket pocket, I said, "Are you asking me to help you pivot your career using my position?" He laughed. He said I was always so intense. He said, "I'm just saying, family helps family." I paid for my own lunch. I walked back to my office in the cold. I did not flip the off switch this time, because the off switch was starting to feel like a way of absorbing things I should have refused to absorb, and I was 31 years old and very tired of absorbing things. I made a decision on that walk back, somewhere along the canal, where the ice was just starting to come in at the edges. It was not a dramatic decision. It was quiet, the way the most important decisions usually are. I decided I was done. Not done with my family. I wasn't going to do anything theatrical. I wasn't going to make speeches or write letters or call a family meeting. A symptom's gonna stop arranging my life around people who had never arranged theirs around me. I was going to stop sending Matinzi without being asked whether I had any. I was going to stop arriving at holidays with casserole dishes full of food I had spent my Saturday making, being useful and invisible and efficient, flipping my internal off switch at Kings's. I was going to be, for the first time in my adult life, a person who existed for her own sake. It's harder than it sounds when you've been performing a function for 30 years. There's a version of you that's just the function, and you have to excavate yourself out from underneath it. I started small. I said no to a request to cover my brother's February rent. I said I was sorry I wasn't able to this month. Nobody said anything for a few days, and then my mother called and said she hoped everything was okay, and I said, yes, everything was fine. I was just focusing on a major work transition. She said, of course, of course. She didn't push. I started therapy. I know that sounds like a television thing to say, but it was the most practically useful thing I had done in years. I started working with a psychologist in Ottawa who specialized in family systems. And in the first session, I described my family dynamics, and she said, in a very measured and professional way, as the emotional and financial support system for a family that doesn't recognize you as a full person, that's a significant burden. I said, yes, that's accurate, she said. How long has it been like this? I said. Since I was 12, I think. There was a silence. She said, okay, let's start there. Easter came. I went because I had agreed to go before I had made my decision on the canal, and because I didn't want to be dramatic, just different. My brother was there with his new girlfriend, who was pleasant and seemed slightly bewildered by the general energy of the household. My father grilled steaks in the backyard despite it being 6 degrees. My uncle told the fishing story. My mother made a ham and asked me 3 times whether I wanted more. At some point during the meal, my brother mentioned my directorship. He mentioned it in the way that he mentioned things, with a proprietary casualness, like he had some claim on it. He said, Cassidy's basically running pandemic response for the whole country now. My father looked up from his steak. He looked at me, really looked at me. And I saw something cross his face that I had never seen there before, or had never let myself see. A flicker of something that might have been recalibration. He didn't say anything. He picked up his fork. He went back to his steak. My mother said, more potatoes? I drove home in the dark. I did not flip the off switch at Kingston. I let myself feel what I actually felt, which was grief, not anger. Grief for the 12-year-old who had stood there with a second-place ribbon in her pocket, waiting, and the 31-year-old who had still, on some level, been waiting for the same thing. The waiting was done. I was done waiting. The spring was busy. The directorship required a full restructuring of my team, a series of briefings with the Deputy Minister of Health, and a cross-country consultation process with provincial health authorities. I was in Vancouver, then Calgary, then Winnipeg, then Halifax. I was building something. I was building the actual infrastructure of outbreak intelligence for a country of 40 million people. And I was doing it without thinking about my brother's rent, or my father's approval, or my mother's potatoes. It was the first time in my adult life that I had felt genuinely, completely present in my own work. In June, there was an outbreak of a novel respiratory pathogen in 3 provinces simultaneously. I can't share the details of the active response, obviously. But what I can tell you is that the system my team had spent 4 years building was activated for the first time in a real event. Real data, real predictions, real public health interventions. Timed and targeted based on our models. It worked better than the simulations had suggested it would. The Deputy Minister called me personally. There was a memo to the Minister of Health. My team, 8 people who had given years of their professional lives to this work, sat in our operations room at 2 a.m. with cold coffee. And the quiet knowledge that something we had built had just protected people. That was the moment. Not any of the other things. Not the grant. Not the Citizen article. Not the directorship announcement. That was the moment where everything became real in a way I had never quite experienced before. I thought of my father's toast to my brother. I thought of the ribbon I had never shown anyone, and I felt, not triumph. Exactly. Completion. Maybe. A circle closing. I didn't call my family that night. I called my best friend, and she cried a little, and I did too. And then we talked for an hour about nothing. About her kids, about a restaurant she'd been to in Toronto, about how she wanted to plant tomatoes this summer. And it was the best phone call I had ever had. 3 weeks later, my father called me. He called on a Sunday morning, which he had never done in my adult life. I looked at the phone for a moment before I answered, because I did not know what version of myself to be for this call. And then I remembered that I had decided to just be myself. I answered. He said, "I saw the piece in the Globe." There had been an article in the Globe and Mail about the outbreak response. A larger public health retrospective, quoting several officials, including me. "My name had appeared twice," he said. "I didn't know the full scope of what you did." "What you do?" I said. "No." A silence. He said, "I wanted to say I'm proud of you." I was at my kitchen table. My cat was on the windowsill. Outside, the June light was doing what June light does in Ottawa. Golden, generous, a little unreal. I sat with what he had said for a long moment. I said, "Thank you for saying that." And then I said, "I needed to hear it a long time ago and I didn't. I want you to know that it mattered, the not hearing it. It shaped a lot of things." He was quiet for a while. He said, "I know." 2 words, but something was different in the way he said them. Not defensive, not deflecting. Just 2 words, landing where they were supposed to land. I didn't cry until after I hung up. I stood at the window next to my cat and let myself cry without flipping anything off, without driving anywhere, without counting kilometers, to the point where I could allow myself to feel it. I cried in my own kitchen in the June light, and then I washed my face and made myself a coffee and sat at the table and thought, this is what it's like to let something actually reach you. I'm not going to tell you that everything changed after that call. It didn't. My father doesn't call on Sundays now. My brother still sends texts that are asking something without asking anything. My mother still leads with news about other people before she asks how I am. Families don't restructure themselves because of one phone call. The grooves are too deep, worn over too many decades. But something did change. In me. I stopped waiting for my contributions to be seen and started seeing them myself. I stopped needing the toast at the table because I had stopped needing the table to tell me what I was worth. I had built something real, something that had worked, something that had mattered in the world. I had done that without any of their validation, without their attention or their approval, or their rye whiskey raised in my direction. And then, quietly, in a June phone call about a Globe article, the validation had come anyway. Too late to heal anything, but not too late to mean something. I still make the drive to my parents' house for the holidays. I still bring food I have cooked. I still sit at the table while my uncle tells the fishing story. And my father grills things in weather that is far too cold for grilling. Some things are just the shape of your life, and you find a way to inhabit them without losing yourself inside them. What's different is that I drive home with the window cracked, even in November. I don't flip the off switch at Kingston anymore. I let the cold air in, and I let myself feel whatever I actually feel, all the way home. Through the dark flat fields and the overpass lights and the slow sprawl of the city coming into view. I am the director of National Outbreak Intelligence. I have been building something that matters, and I didn't need anyone's toast to know it.